The Chicago Bears' initial 53-man roster is set with a few surprises and a few moves still to come.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time. On the show today, we look at this initial Chicago Bears 53-man roster, the biggest moves, the biggest changes, the biggest surprises throughout this process, and then the moves that are still to come. The roster that we have at 53 on Tuesday afternoon's deadline is not the 53-man roster that will take the field week 1 against the Tennessee Titans. You just have to get to 53 to start the season, but you're still going to claim players on waivers and sign other free agents from other teams and move on from a few guys that thought they made it initially, but won't actually make it with the team until week 1. And we'll also look at some of the guys who didn't make the initial roster that look like strong candidates to fill out this team's practice squad that will also include some players from outside of the organization. But when we look at the decisions Ryan Poles had to make to get down to 53 players, we knew the positions that were going to be most, I don't want to say controversial, but most difficult, right? Some questions about who is going to be the kick returners / the end of the roster wide receivers and running backs. Some questions about the offensive and defensive line depth with some injuries at those spots. And then the cornerback spot as well are kind of the big areas of unknowns entering into this process. And we got some answers Tuesday afternoon with a few surprises throughout the process. So like when you talk about the running back position and the wide receivers, where third-round pick Velus Jones is kind of a hybrid between the two, and we wondered, would that keep them from keeping a fourth running back like Travis Homer on the 53? Would he count as the sixth wide receiver or the fourth running back? Would they keep 6 wide receivers and then add Velus Jones as a running back in that mix? As of now, he kind of counts more like a wide receiver. The Bears kept DeAndre Swift, Khalil Herbert, Roschon Johnson, and Travis Homer as that fourth running back, and kept Velus Jones as kind of the 6th wide receiver there. Because I wouldn't imagine that they view him as necessarily the number 5 running back. I don't think they would keep 5 running backs with Swift, Herbert, Johnson, Homer, and Velus Jones. So perhaps they will use Jones in the backfield at times, but I think they still view him as a wide receiver because they only kept 6 total players there, including him, with DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze, Tyler Scott, DeAndre Carter, and Velus Jones. We're expecting at this point, based on how the 53-man roster shaped out, that Velus Jones will likely be your top kickoff return option, and DeAndre Carter may then be your top punt return option. But we've seen Tyler Scott get kickoff return opportunities next to Velus Jones. We've seen cornerback Josh Blackwell get punt return opportunities in place of DeAndre Carter, and Josh Blackwell made the 53-man roster, another player whose spot was far from guaranteed, and we wondered how this cornerback battle would shape up on the other side of the ball. But he sticks as the 5th or 6th cornerback, depending on how you want to count it, but Jalen Jones, Tyreek Stevenson, Kyler Gordon, your 3 starters, and then Terrell Smith, Jalen Jones, and Josh Blackwell are your 3 backups. Greg Stroman hits the streets, Reddy Stewart, a free agent now as well, but sticking with Blackwell and Jalen Jones at the bottom of your cornerback depth chart as well. So that answers where they view some of the young depth at that position, where you felt very fortunate to be having to decide between some really quality players at that spot. You wonder if someone like Greg Stroman will still end up on someone's 53-man roster, if not right away in week one, certainly at some point down the line as he ends up on somebody's practice squad and gets another shot, because he played well for the Bears this preseason and has played well for the Bears in the regular season in the past. So those were two of the fiercest open battles of hey, they've got 2 or 3 good players at running back, at wide receiver, at corner, and it was not a question of exactly how many they'll keep, but more out of the guys they have, which 2 will they keep, or which 1 will they keep at that position, as opposed to a true numbers question of, we kind of thought they'd keep 6 wide receivers and 6 corners. It wasn't how many wide receivers or corners they're going to keep, but it's which will be the last 1 or 2 players out of the 6, because we kind of knew at least who the top 4 were at each respective spot. Whereas the offensive and the defensive line were bigger questions about, based on the injuries at those respective positions, how many players would they choose to keep on those lines, as an indication of how concerned they are about the injuries, or how long-term they suspect the injuries will be. So on the offensive line, to jump back there, for example, we saw the Bears keep 10 total offensive linemen, 10 defensive linemen as well, but 10 total offensive linemen, 4 guys who can play offensive tackle, 3 guys who can play guard, and 3 guys who will play center. With Larry Borum moving to injured reserve, Matt Pryor takes over as your top backup offensive tackle, along with Karan Amagaji. Pryor played guard for most of the preseason, but we heard Matt Eberflus endorse Pryor as the top backup tackle in Borum's absence. Plus, Amagashi has some guard and tackle versatility. But they also kept Bill Murray as their top backup guard. I imagine Pryor is probably both their top backup tackle and top backup guard, but you have to have another guard option if Pryor is going to have to fill in at tackle. So Murray makes the 53-man roster ahead of Jatari Carter and the rest of the guards under contract this offseason. He played well and moved his way up the depth chart and was one of these guys that you wouldn't have projected in the 53 when training camp started, but earned his way on to the 53-man roster. And then with the injury to backup center / guard Ryan Bates, the Bears were forced to keep a third center on the initial 53-man roster, with former third-round pick Doug Kramer making the team as, for now, the top backup center on the roster because Bates is injured. Bates was not placed on injured reserve ahead of the initial 53-man roster cut down, but he could still be. And that's one of the moves that might still be coming in the next 24 hours, maybe even as you're listening to this podcast. That's the danger this time of year. We talk about roster moves that have been done and ones that haven't been done yet. But over the next 24 hours, this is still a fast-moving time. There's going to be more moves happening. And I want to take a look at what some of the initial next steps are, with at least 2 players and maybe 3 still being added to injured reserve in the very near future. The Bears clearing up spaces to bring one of their cut players back, and probably a replacement player at another position, and possibly another outside player or 2 being brought in to bolster this roster at some of their other positions of need. So we'll look at some of the moves that are still to come after the initial 53-man roster has been submitted, next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by Gametime, the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. I have the Gametime app downloaded on my phone, and I use it all the time. I just recently went and saw Green Day with Smashing Pumpkins as their opener. It was a great show. I had such a good time, and I got my tickets on Gametime. I've also used it to see comedians, to see theater shows, to go to Chicago Bears games as well. Any kind of live event in your city, they've got tickets on Gametime. And what I love about the app is that with Gametime, you can see the view from the seat you're buying before you buy the ticket. So you can have a sense of okay, in this venue, what am I getting for my purchase? What is my view of the stage going to be? And you also know how much you're going to pay because Gametime has all-in pricing, so you don't get any of those added fees at the end of the checkout process that make your ticket end up costing way more than you thought it would, and then, okay, maybe I'm going to go back and pick different tickets that'll cost less because of the fees that add on to the end. Like, none of that nonsense. It's all very straightforward. So that's why you get to take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets. What time is it? Gametime. So we know what this initial Chicago Bears 53-man roster will look like, but the roster that Ryan Poles submits to the league office on Tuesday afternoon is never the roster that they submit to the Tennessee Titans in 2 weeks for week one, or like 2.5 weeks, or whatever, however, 3 weeks really, as it ends up playing out here. There are still going to be changes that may have already started by the time you listen to this podcast. The Bears are kind of playing their cards with the injured reserve game, and there were some changes to the injured reserve rules that gave them a little bit more flexibility ahead of the deadline. And then they'll now take advantage of the rest of the injured reserve rules now that the 53-man roster has been set. So the new rules are that, let me take a step back. Normally, or in the past, if you put a player on injured reserve before Tuesday at 3 o'clock when the rosters are submitted, and in the past, any player who went on injured reserve before that was automatically out for the year. You could not designate a player for return from injured reserve if they went on IR before the 53-man roster deadline. If you wanted to, quote-unquote, stash a player on short-term injured reserve, you had to have them on your 53-man roster while injured that you submit to the league office at 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon. The NFL has updated that rule so that you are allowed 2 players before the 53-man roster cutdown that you can put on injured reserve and designate them for return. So the Bears did that with Larry Borum on the offensive line and Jake Martin on the defensive line. Both of those players went on short-term injured reserve, or I guess it's full injured reserve, but were designated to return. That they have to be out a minimum of 4 weeks, and then the Bears can activate them for a practice window of, I think, 2 weeks, and then you can activate them any point after those first 4 weeks that they miss out, and you get 2 weeks to decide whether or not to activate them or not. And then, they could still be out for the rest of the year if they want to, but they're designated that they should be able to return after a minimum of 4 weeks on injured reserve. You only get 2. The Bears also placed wide receiver Dante Pettis on injured reserve, but he is not designated for return. So they have said Pettis is out for the year no matter what. They could choose to waive him with an injury designation and let him sign with another team, but there is no path for Dante Pettis to play for the Chicago Bears this season. They have placed him on injured reserve and have ended his season. Because you can only designate 2 guys that way, there are still more players the Bears are going to put on injured reserve, but they want to still give the short-term designation, so they couldn't do that before the 53-man roster deadline, but can now do it that their initial 53 has been submitted. They had to submit the roster with, hey, injured players who are on our active roster that they will now put on injured reserve, which will free up roster spaces to then add more players that are not currently on the 53-man roster. Which, or I guess the better question is, how many of those players is what's still to be determined. It's been reported by Brad Biggs of the Chicago Tribune and others that the team is expected, which means planning to, and will, place long snapper Patrick Scales on injured reserve. He has been injured for the last few weeks of the preseason, and training camp has not been able to practice with the team. They will put him on injured reserve and likely bring back undrafted rookie free agent Cameron Lyons, who was the long snapper during training camp and was long snapping the last couple of preseason games, and have him be the long snapper until Patrick Scales is healthy and ready to return to the team. And then they will probably then waive Cameron Lyons at that point and bring back Patrick Scales as a long snapper. That position is a little bit more self-contained. they're only going to roster one player at a time there. They kept Scales on the initial 53, but he's definitely destined for IR here, and a replacement is coming. But there are two other players who I still think could end up on injured reserve and give the Bears an opportunity to replace them with a roster spot. One is for sure happening. So if you look at the Bears' 53-man roster, they released fullback Kari Blasingame. As of the initial 53 that they submitted, they do not have a fullback under contract. It has been reported that the Bears plan to bring Kari Blasingame back to the 53-man roster, but in order to work some of the numbers properly, they released him initially, but do plan to bring him back. And so if they plan to bring him back, they plan to then create a roster spot for Kari Blasingame. And I suspect that if you needed to create a roster spot for Kari Blasingame, you're not just going to cut another player because otherwise you would have just cut that player and kept Kari. So they're going to place one more player on injured reserve, but needed them to get through the 53-man roster deadline so that it can be short-term injured reserve. And that player will either be center Ryan Bates or defensive tackle Zach Pickens. Both players have been injured. Both players are expected to miss multiple weeks to start the season, but we don't know the exact duration of either of their injuries. So it's hard to say with certainty which one will be the one that goes on injured reserve to replace or to free up a space for Kari Blasingame. I would suspect if you could bet on which player was going to injured reserve on FanDuel Sportsbook, which there isn't, but we could make some real money here if we were betting on it, I would bet that backup center Ryan Bates goes on injured reserve because they kept Doug Kramer on the 53-man roster as sort of the third center there. And if Ryan Bates' injury were, super short term and maybe he could play in week one, they wouldn't have kept a third center. But they only kept 4 defensive tackles. So there's not an extra backup behind Zach Pickens. So if you put Pickens on injured reserve, you have exactly 3 defensive tackles on your roster. And that doesn't necessarily feel like enough for a minimum 4-week stint on injured reserve for Zach Pickens. Yes, you can kick DeMarcus Walker into defensive tackle. Some of the other guys can play some of those spots, but if Pickens goes on injured reserve, they will likely need another defensive tackle. And so I would imagine Bates goes on IR. The Bears re-sign Kari Blasingame. And then they could still put Zach Pickens on injured reserve also. But if they do, that would free up another roster space that they would then use to bring in another defensive tackle. But you couldn't put Zach Pickens on IR first because you already used your 2 spots on Larry Borum and Jake Martin. So you put your 53 in with an injured Ryan Bates and an injured Zach Pickens, and then you put one or maybe both of them, plus an injured Patrick Scales, on injured reserve after the roster cutdown, and then you free up as many as 3 roster spaces to bring in a new long snapper, bring back your fullback, Kari Blasingame, and then most likely bring back another defensive tackle to replace Zach Pickens if that injury is indeed long-term enough to justify a short-term stint on injured reserve. That'll be a minimum of the first 3 weeks of the season. Keep in mind, we still have a little bit less than 3 weeks until the Bears play their first regular season game. So that if Ryan Bates or Zach Pickens' injury is something that, hey, they can recover from in 2 more weeks, that's all they need, and then they can play week 1, well, then they don't need to go on IR. Or maybe if it takes 3 more weeks. A short-term injured reserve guarantees they miss the first 4 games of the season. So you're only putting a player on that list if you really feel like, man, they're just not going to be available for another month and a half based on their current injury situation. That was the case for Larry Borum on the offensive line. That was the case for Jake Martin on the defensive line. And we will soon find out whether that's the case for Ryan Bates at center, Zach Pickens at defensive tackle. I imagine at least one of them will end up on IR. And then we'll get a better sense of what this week 1 53-man roster will actually look like. And over the next couple days, we'll also get a sense of what this Bears practice squad will look like. And I want to go through some of the players they released who are most likely to stick around on the practice squad, plus the positions where they're probably going to need to bring in somebody from outside of the 90-man training camp roster to fill out the rest of that practice squad. Next on Locked On Bears. The practice squad is always difficult to predict, much like the initial 53-man roster, because we can't fully predict which players from outside of the organization are going to come in and fill those spots, especially because the practice squad is now 16 players. It used to be 10, and I think before that it was even 8. So it was a little bit easier to go through your 90-man roster and find 8 guys that you would like to keep around on your practice squad. At 16, that's almost one of every single starting position, right? I mean, if there's 22 starters on both sides of the ball, you can keep all but 5 there. So, you're going to keep a quarterback, a running back, at least a couple receivers, a tight end, a handful of offensive linemen, a handful of defensive linemen, a linebacker or 2, a cornerback or 2, and a safety or 2. And there probably weren't 16 players on the 90-man roster that the Bears feel like, oh, we definitely have to have back on our 90-man roster, or on our practice squad. But there are still a pretty good handful where I think they'll be able to fill out most of their practice squad with guys who are around, and I think they can then find better options or just more intriguing options, because sometimes it's like, okay, guys who are with you in training camp, you kind of learned through training camp that, you know what, we liked him initially, but after seeing him for a month and a half, we know what he is, and he's not that good. So let's bring in an outside guy who we don't know exactly what he is, put him on the practice squad, and then we can get a sense over the course of the season whether he's a player we want to stick around or let him go from the practice squad and, try something else there. But sort of the devil you know versus the devil you don't. And the practice squad is an easier opportunity to bring in outside guys, test them out for a little bit, see how they fit in, and then, without really a lot of stakes towards that acquisition for your team. But when I think about the guys who were here and who stood out at training camp or still have some intriguing possibilities here, I think the biggest practice squad question we're going to face is the quarterback room. The Bears released both Brett Rippon and undrafted rookie free agent quarterback Austin Reed. So Bagent and Caleb Williams are your only 2 QBs on the active roster. They are definitely going to keep a third quarterback on the practice squad. It might not be out of the question to keep 2 quarterbacks on the practice squad, but probably not. Most likely they will keep one of Rippon or Reed on the practice squad as the third quarterback. Clearly, Brett Rippon was the third string quarterback throughout the preseason. Austin Reed was definitely the fourth, and Brett Rippon has the most experience of any of the quarterbacks in this Bears quarterback room. He's been in the NFL the longest. I don't know if he's barely thrown more passes, but has played in basically the same number of games as Bagent, but he's learned more offenses. He's definitely the most, NFL experienced quarterback in that room. So presumably he will be the quarterback on the practice squad, but I can also see where maybe at this stage of Brett Rippon's career, we kind of know what he is and what he isn't. He's not a starting caliber quarterback in the NFL. He hasn't really been a number 2 caliber quarterback in the NFL in 4 or 5 seasons now. So maybe the Bears might feel like, hey, today Rippon is the better quarterback, but Reed might still be able to become more and develop into something more, and was also good enough that we could still rely on him as potentially our number 3 quarterback. That one's tough to predict right now. I could really see it going either way, but that will be the most interesting practice squad decision to keep tabs on. The Bears had a few young wide receivers in camp, guys like Colin Johnson, who was the star of the Hall of Fame game and was in Hard Knocks a little bit, plus Peter LeBlanc, and then Caleb Williams' friend John Jackson, who was college teammates with him briefly. I think Colin Johnson is clearly the favorite to make the practice squad that way. I would guess they will keep more than one wide receiver just because you got 16 guys, and a receiver is a position where you have 6 on the active roster, so maybe you want to have an extra on practice squad in addition to Colin Johnson. I could see them going outside of the organization for a second receiver there, but I think Colin Johnson is pretty likely to have another spot there. I think he spent some time on the practice squad last year. The Bears have been investing development time in him. He showed some of that in the preseason. Keep him around, see if he can keep making another step forward there. Similarly, difficult decision at tight end, where Brendan Bates was the undrafted free agent of this year, who you feel like has some real chops, that made some nice plays for the team in the preseason, and you hope can continue to develop into something. But like Steven Carlson was more of the veteran number 4 tight end, and maybe he makes the practice squad instead. Maybe you keep both of them, but much like Rippon and Reed, it's like, do you keep the veteran who you kind of know who he is, or do you keep the undrafted rookie free agent because, yeah, maybe he's not better right now, but he could still become better someday in the very near future, so you invest in his development more than the player who may already be what he's going to be in the NFL. On the offensive line, Ja'Tari Carter is definitely making this practice squad. If he doesn't end up on another 53-man roster somewhere else, he could also choose to just go to someone else's practice squad, but someone will bring Ja'Tari Carter in. Whether it's their active roster or their practice squad, he will be a part of a team's organization's practices throughout this season. He's played NFL games. He's played a little tackle and, of course, guard throughout this preseason. There's some versatility and some talent there. If the Bears don't keep him around on the squad, someone else will for sure. I also suspect that given the injury to Ryan Bates at center and Doug Kramer making the 53, that their 4th-string center from the preseason, Jerome Carvin, is likely to land back on the practice squad. He played guard and center, has that positional versatility. I didn't think he was anything special, but you just need guys who can snap the ball, who know the offense, and Carvin is definitely one of those guys who's around for that. The Bears are also going to definitely keep multiple 2, 3, 4, maybe even defensive linemen on this practice squad. I think the 2 top guys from the 90-man roster are Jamry Chroma, the undrafted free agent from James Madison at defensive end, and then Keith Randolph was the undrafted free agent from Illinois. The Bears gave a decent amount of guaranteed money to for an undrafted rookie free agent. They had 2 others in Jalen Hutchings and Deshaun Mallory. They had 3 UDFA defensive tackles. They could keep any of the 3, but Randolph was kind of the favorite of the 3, at least heading into training camp. So I would imagine they may want to keep him around and trying to develop that. At linebacker, Micah Baskerville was another preseason standout for the 2nd year in a row. Didn't make the 53, but made plays in the preseason, and a guy who would definitely be next man up. If there's any injuries, even to a backup linebacker, Baskerville is like right on the fringe of making the team. Same with Reddy Stewart at cornerback. We talked about him and Greg Stroman as being guys who were really close to making the 53. Stewart made some nice interceptions, can play the slot, can play a little bit outside. Like he's a real intriguing undrafted rookie from Troy who you feel like can still develop into something, as opposed to Greg Stroman, who played really well, but he's in his 6th or 7th season. Like, we kind of know what he is and what he isn't. I don't know that he's going to take this big step forward at this stage of his career, whereas Stewart can still keep growing and keep feeling things out. So those are the guys who are under contract in training camp that I think are the top candidates. Other guys could still make the roster, but it's worth noting there, like Ian Wheeler, the running back, is on IR. So the Bears will need a running back on the practice squad, and they don't have any others who are with the team through training camp. So some sort of running back from outside of the organization is very likely to land on this practice squad just to have some depth there. They're going to need to add an offensive tackle and probably another guard or another center, another interior offensive lineman, most likely from outside of the organization. Maybe the rookie Theo Benedict, who on Hard Knocks, pulled off the tearaway pants to reveal an Eagle Speedo and sang proud to be an American. Like, he could make the practice squad, although he's injured, so I don't think they'll put him on while he's injured, but if he, once he gets healthy again, maybe that's a possibility. And they're going to keep more defensive linemen than just one defensive end and one defensive tackle. I would bet at least 3 make this practice squad because the Bears have an injury at defensive tackle and need guys in the ecosystem that they could call up from the practice squad in a pinch if they need some more depth at that spot, as well as a safety. I don't know that any of the Bears' safeties are prime practice squad candidates. Guys like Adrian Colbert and Tavarius Moore, like, they're veterans who've been around the block a little bit. I don't know if they want to spend the season on the Bears' practice squad or not. Maybe, but you can only keep so many vested veterans on the squad, and we'll see if that lines up for what the Bears want and what those veteran players want. Certainly, if the Bears make any big changes to their 53-man roster between now and the end of the week, you can be sure we'll break it down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If you're looking for your second listen, check out a podcast for your other team, maybe your fantasy football team, with Locked On Fantasy Football, bringing you daily insight to the best fantasy draft strategies, waiver wire pickups, and lineup decisions all season long. Of course, we got all of your favorite sports teams covered: baseball, basketball, college football, college sports in general. You name it, we've got it for you here on hockey as well. All part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Coming back tomorrow, make Locked On Bears your first listen once again. And in exchange, I'll be sure to give you another opportunity to bear down.